Hello and welcome to a slightly unusual series of podcasts of the A&amp podcast. In September, I joined Fiona Wells from Patch, friend of the show Vicki McKeown, and strategic lead for Adoption England Sarah Johal to speak at the Safeguarding in Adoption online conference. With over 500 tickets requested, we were overwhelmed with the interest in this subject that affects so many families. The speakers and questions all brought a perspective that needs to be listened to by all those responsible for supporting adoptive families. You can also find details in the show notes of the work that Fiona, Vicki and Sarah do.
Hi everyone, this is Sarah Johal, strategic lead for Adoption England, who's here to talk from a UK situation. I don't know. You tell us, Sarah. I've just been talking for half an hour. My brain's gone numb.
Oh, thank you, Fiona. Yes, I'm Sarah Johal, and my job title is that I'm the National Adoption Strategic Lead, and I work with the 33 regional adoption agencies across the country. So I'm really pleased that you've invited me here today. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to hear your discussions to date. So I hope that you've had a good morning. I've just been having a quick look through the chat, and it seems like there's been really interesting points raised and some ideas and thoughts about different places that can help. So that's really good. So I've kind of just prepared a little bit of some thoughts and reflections really on the topic of discussion today. And then I'm sure that there'll be some sort of questions and answers when Al returns from his darkened room and having got his coffee. I'm sure he will spark some discussion and debate, and I'm sure you will as well, Fiona.
Yes, absolutely.
So I guess the first thing to say is that I do recognise the issues raised, having listened to adoptive parents in different regions of the country. They've explained these issues to me in great detail. I also attended the Potato Conference earlier in the year, and an organisation that supports parents of traumatised adopted teenagers, many of whom have had similar experiences. And I'm grateful to them and to you, Fiona, and all the group of parents who put down the experiences in that report that you provided called The Jarring Reality of Adoption. It is a very sobering read. At the Potato Conference, I also heard from some young people about their experiences, about the difficulties they experienced. And I guess what was really interesting, they were able to share what support helped them and what didn't help them. And I guess I'm also keen to hear more about the young people's experiences when there is a crisis, to add to the discussion of the different approaches taken as part of this debate today. As a social worker for more than 30 years, it saddens me to see that adoptive families who we have assessed and matched with children do not feel that they have been given the support that they need before they reach a crisis point. With families, I often hear trying to access the right support to help them earlier on to better meet the needs of their children, and have struggled to do so. I know that we've improved adoption support compared to when I started in adoption over 20 years ago. But this is quite patchy still, and there's a lot more to do. So I meet with RA leaders regularly, and we've had discussions about this very topic, and they also recognise the issues that have been raised. And I've also spoken to some of the senior leaders within local authorities, and they recognise that for many of these children, the system does not help and support families in crisis. So there is an acknowledgement that we need to do something different. And I wanted to share with you some of the work that's progressing upstream to hopefully prevent families from reaching a crisis, and also to share some of the challenges of the system when looking at the interface between the regional adoption agencies and the children's front door teams and the locality teams who are responsible for dealing with the referrals into children's social care. So I hope that might be helpful. So one of the areas that we've been focusing on in adoption support, and there's a lot to do in this space, and we've had to prioritise, is really founded upon the Adoption England strategy, which outlines the area of work around adoption support. And Alison Lewis from Adoption West leads on this work with 3 or 4 other RA leaders helping her with this work. And a lot of it is focusing on prevention. So, for example, the development of the assessment and preparation of adopters to better understand the impact of trauma, and not only the impact of trauma, but also the impact of caring for traumatised children upon caregivers, and the importance of the support and also self-care, and the likely fact that you will need support throughout the child's lives, particularly at different points. We have developed some national practice standards around the adopter journey, and we've had a lot of consultation with adoptive parents around that to make sure we get that preparation period right. And these are being launched in October in National Adoption Week, with some further work going on around the preparation in the new year. We've also been looking at getting that core offer of support for families right at the beginning of when children move in with their families. And in the last month, we've implemented some new pilots with a new framework for early support and a core offer to provide, I guess, a firm foundation to help with the building blocks of parenting traumatized children, looking at reflective or therapeutic parenting, supporting the relationships between adults and the children, and really understanding the child's journey to help pick up issues early on with a range of support for families. We've also been looking at multidisciplinary approaches to support families, and we've got about 7 of the regional agencies being supported with funding, so the government are supporting us with this, to do some work with health partners and education partners to provide a more holistic approach to working with families to find the right support. I guess having that clinical oversight and skilling up staff within the areas is proving to be very, very beneficial. And I think hearing some of the early research that we've just had done coming from the evaluations suggests that this approach is actually quite promising. Somebody's raised it in the chat about the issue of maintaining relationships with children with their birth family after adoption. And we know that that can be really difficult and often plays a part in families reaching crisis, particularly as children go into teenage years. And it plays a really important part. So the culture change work that we're trying to do around a preventative approach to some of this work and making sure that children have a good understanding of their identity and that some of those relationships with birth families, where safe and appropriate, is managed well right from the start. And then, of course, how we support families in crisis is really important moving forward. And it's something that we've been looking at. And this workshop is a good opportunity to listen and get the views on how we kind of move that forward in conjunction with families. Just to say something about the interface between the regional adoption agencies and the local children's services teams. And people who know anything about regional adoption agencies will know that this varies in each area. Some RAAs have really good relationships with the front door safeguarding teams, and in others the relationship is more difficult. More often than not, due to priorities around workload, changes in staff which can make relationships more difficult to achieve and develop. RAAs sometimes put referrals through for additional support to children's services where the referral is not accepted, and that can be equally frustrating for staff as well as for families. Sometimes the reason is that the family already has an adoption support social worker, and so why does the children's team need to be involved? So trying to understand and be clear about what is the responsibility of the adoption support team within the RAA, and also then what's the responsibility of the children's social work team, is something that a couple of the RAAs are now writing down and doing some work with their partners to explain the different roles and responsibilities to get a shared understanding of how this interface works and how it can work better together. There are some good examples of where things work well. An agreement is reached where a social worker from a locality team becomes involved, as well as the adoption support worker, joint working, and sometimes so that families can access services which otherwise could not be accessed by the adoption support teams, which can often help prevent an escalation of a crisis. For example, just to give you a bit more detail, so if you want to access short breaks provision, if you want to access maybe individual support work or family support or edge of care services, you have to have an allocated social worker. You can't access this if you're an adoption support worker. So some of this work in some areas, I know in Adopt Central England, they've got an agreement that you don't actually need to have an allocated social worker if you need to access some of these services. There's a pathway agreed that means that referrals can be achieved so you could get access to more services. So some of that joint work might be supported on Child in Need plan, but this is in pockets and it's definitely not universal. So that's something that people are looking at. What might be interesting to know is that the University of Birmingham is leading some research in this area, which will hopefully shine a light in more detail on the issues about any themes coming from this. So What they're trying to do is to develop a clearer understanding of children and families' post-order welfare and safeguarding concerns, how they arise and are best addressed. So they're basically looking at reviewing families who have adopted, reviewing special guardianship families, and they're looking at a period over about the last 3 or 4 years where children became subject to child in need or child protection plans, or the child came into care, but also crucially had some support from the adoption or the kinship special guardianship teams. They'll be interviewing special guardians, adopters about their child's difficulties, the experience of the support or the safeguarding interventions, the potential improvements. Has it made a difference? They'll be interviewing professionals about their experiences as well. That research is due to be published early next year, and we really hope that there's going to be some learning from this, which we can take forward to look at a different approach. There are 1 or 2 RAAs working with their local authority partners to develop a different approach to families accessing children's services at the front door. This work is in its infancy, and we're doing some thinking as to how we might join up some of these discussions and have more of a national approach as to how we consider and address these issues. And I noticed that Kathy's on the call today, and Kathy in Together for Adoption in the Northwest, they're doing some work with their local authorities. I've been looking at different work that's going on around the sector, and I'm very struck by the work that has developed around contextual safeguarding over the last couple of years, which I think has some parallels, and I think there might be some learning from this work and thinking around these lines to look at a different approach or a pathway for adoptive families accessing support from children's social care. And just to give you a bit of an information about that pathway, it's called the ROTH pathway. It's risk outside of the home pathway. And it essentially provides a structure through which social workers can organise a support plan or a child protection response when a young person is at significant risk of harm, and that harm is principally or solely outside of the family. So they call it extra-familial. Of course, you and I will know that a traditional child protection response is likely to focus on changing the actions of parents as a source of protection instead of changing, in the case of contextual safeguarding, instead of changing peer, the school, or the community context where harm outside the family occurs. And I guess for those children, such a traditional approach has not been sufficient, and also, a bit like this situation, holds parents accountable for the harm that sometimes actually is beyond their control. And yet the harms that those children experience are so severe that a non-statutory framework wouldn't provide sufficient oversight to meet their needs. So in that case, something else was developed. And in parallel to this situation, I think some of the key principles which I've taken from that approach, and there's a really good report from the Durham University about the pilots that have undertaken this approach. And I think the relevance in this context is treating the parents as equal partners, listening and reflecting with parents about the needs of the children and young people and of the family. And I guess also using language that demonstrates a caring intention. We know adopters want the best for their family, and treating them in this way through appropriate language and the relational communication is really important. I think also recognising the system or the services and the harms that we have done to children and young people. So often their experiences of education, their experiences of accessing health provision, that often provides a lot of harm for children, and also the interface potentially with accessing services and support. We have to recognise that actually does produce some harm, and what we don't want to do is re-traumatise children or families. And then the other aspect in terms of that pilot was looking at the professionals' responses, being very much centred on the young person's best interests, and sometimes taking risks in doing that. So it's not a traditional child protection response in that way. And I think that the learning from this, as well as speaking to people with lived experience, may give us an opportunity to think differently about how adoptive families access support when they approach children's services, and potentially a different pathway that is in the best interest of children. We must listen to what adoptive parents are telling us, and there's so many voices now from across the country. We really need this to help us move the discussion forward for creating change for the better. So Fiona, that's a bit of a kind of overview, fair enough, a bit of a whistle-stop tour of some of my reflections at this stage about the discussion that we're having today. So I kind of welcome the debate. I think there is an appetite for change, and there is an appetite to look at something. It's a question of how we take it forward and the framework that we can do that in. I know I've spoken to the Department for Education about these issues. I've spoken to the Chief Social Worker about these issues. She's very much aware of the issues, and like me, she's very interested in how we explore and understand some of the issues that have been raised and how we move the discussion forward, really. So hope that's okay. Happy to have any further discussion.
There are a few questions. I suppose one of them, which I absolutely agree with, is national adoption breakdown rates. There isn't any collated data, is there?
No, so basically there's a report that comes out every year called the 903 Children's Return, which basically it's a statistical analysis of all children that are involved in children's social care, from looked after children, children adopted, but also children who are in need of help and protection. Now, local authorities, there is something on the system that they can flag when a child who comes into care or accesses services, they're the legal status, so whether they were adopted. The problem is that not many people complete it.
Yes.
And so you do get some information, but it's not necessarily an accurate reflection. And some of the RAAs have been doing some work in their local regions to, if you like, cross-check and cross-reference. So some of those families will be open to the adoption support teams, and then they ask the local authorities to say, can you tell us about adopted children in your patch? So they've been doing some cross-checking, and what's clear is it's not the same. So I know there's some work going on locally, but nationally there is an ability to be able to gather that data. The problem is it's not reliable. I think that's partly the issue.
Yeah, no, I kind of remember that. I knew that, but I'd forgotten it. But in relation to how we progress that, like, I get that things are coming and things are happening and things are moving, and I absolutely appreciate you coming and speaking to us today. It was really informative. Thank you. You know, you say the Department of Education, I'm part of the adopter reference group, so I know that they're always interested in the issues that we bring to the table.
Yeah.
And it's Isabel Trowler's the Chief Social Worker, and I've sent her many emails. And I think I've met her once. And I do bang the drum for these things to be discussed and changed. But when asked, I mean, for me, the data research is a really, like, without a window of what's going on.
Yeah.
We don't know how many families are suffering this. And, you know, there needs that data's critical. How seriously is that being considered, do you think?
Well, I think that the data that we'll get from the research at the University of Birmingham will be really insightful, and I feel that might be a little bit of a catalyst for some reflection and some looking forward in terms of what some of the learning from that. I think nationally, in terms of the data, it's really quite difficult to ensure that data is correct. So I think there's a will to collecting that data. Yeah. The question is how you can ensure that happens, and that's quite difficult. So, for example, if you look at the adoption data set, the RAA's quality assure that with the local authorities to try and make sure that we get that better. So we could potentially ask them to do that with the data that local authorities submit about adoption breakdowns post-order, so that we get some better reflection of that. We'd have to go back and have that discussion with them. But that might be a way, because there is the facility to be able to have that information on the 903 return. To be honest with you, Fiona, the facility's there. It's a question of how we get that better recorded. And obviously, it depends on if parents state that, you know, when children come into contact with children's services. So there's two elements to it. But yes, I think that it's definitely possible to get a bit of better data around that, so we can see how we can move that forward.
What would be your message today to families such as mine, such as ours, who've faced some of the blame for not managing some of the issues our children sadly come with?
Well, the message from me really, and I'm sure from my colleagues, is that we're really, really sorry that experience has happened. You know, you put yourself forward to adopt children. You were prepared. You were matched with those children. You know, we have a responsibility to support you, to provide scaffolding, to make sure that you are in the best place to provide the support for your children in terms of what they need. And we need to do better. We absolutely need to do better. We also have a responsibility because, you know, sadly, there are some situations where children are abused within adoptive families. So there is also an element, of course, we have to make sure that children are safeguarded and their needs are promoted and looked after. But I'd very much want us to get to a point where there is an equal partnership in that relationship. In terms of the discussion we had around that contextual safeguarding approach, I really like that, learning from that approach as a principle. And maybe that feels to me like that might be something that we could do and something we could look at in terms of whether we can get an academic partner to work with the two sites that are currently doing some work around this, to really think about what would we need to do differently, and maybe looking at whether we have, you know, a working group of adoptive parents and families to work alongside that. I'm also interested in, I'm not sure we've heard enough from the young people. And it would be really good to hear more from the young people about their experiences of that. And that's quite tricky because obviously in crisis, it's not necessarily something you really want to talk about. But maybe we can learn something from those young people who are now a little bit older, reflecting back. I was really struck at the Potato Group conference, hearing from a couple of young people who were able to really, well, you know, very difficult circumstances for those young people, were really able to articulate what helped them. So yeah, let's have some more conversations on it.
My daughter would definitely engage with something. She is so reflective of how her circumstances have changed over the last 8 months, and you know how she's not getting beaten by her brothers anymore has made such a difference to her life, and how our relationship's not in crisis anymore. And you know, they have to be in a position of safety to reflect, but
yes,
there are children out there who are able to converse, and we can get their voices, and they're massive. You know, one of the reasons I keep doing this is and you know, my daughter's like, well, why are you doing this, Mum? And I'm like, because you should have got better, and so should I. Right. And she, well, yeah, fair enough. And she won't speak to a social worker again because they didn't understand her.
Right.
And they put words in her mouth, and it's all of us together working towards this. It's not, you know, it's all of us working in a joint partnership to bring this ahead.
Exactly. Yeah, definitely.
Can I ask just a few questions? I don't want to hold your feet to the fire, but you know, we've got you now, haven't we? You know, we've got you. So let's warm the coals, and here we go. So I'll start with an easy question. You mentioned some research in Birmingham around disruption and breakdown. Do you have a sort of rough idea of if that's available, when it will be available?
Yeah, we're hoping that it'll be available early in the new year. We know that they finished all the groundwork. I was talking to Alison Lewis, who's our representative on the group, and she said that they're collating all of the information and putting it all together in a report. So she was hoping to hopefully see some sort of draft this side of Christmas, with a view to it being sort of shared after Christmas. I think that's going to be really interesting. And I think they really want to pull out some sort of key themes and some lessons from that, which I think might be really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the cynic in me, so you know me, so I'm not naturally cynical, but the cynic in me would suggest, well, we had things like Beyond the Adoption Order in 2014 that sort of said the same things, and it feels like are we just sort of recirculating same data from a different perspective? Is that the concern? And do you think that this is a sort of links into a question that was asked, have you got any sense of the new government's kind of take on any of this, or their position on any of these issues around adoption?
So there's two questions there. I think in terms of the beyond the adoption order, absolutely, this talked about a third of people who've adopted families in crisis. I think what this research does is it really drills down into child in need, child protection, and looked after children. So it's really kind of niche about that interface with children's social work teams, which I don't think we've had a nuance that quite a lot of them are involved, but not detail, and very specifically about their views and opinions, but also a deep dive into the child's records. So there will be an analysis of cross-referencing what people are saying, what professionals are saying, and the records to look at that kind of any themes and cross analysis. So the two sets of data will be put together. So I think that's different. And yeah, I'm hopeful that there might be some themes that are emerging from that, which might give us some insight. In terms of this government, the Children's Minister is very, very supportive of adoption. Obviously, it's in the manifesto for the government as a key priority. But I also understand that this particular minister is very passionate and an advocate for adoption, but really wants to see improvements around adoption support. She's also very particularly interested in education, which I think is really encouraging, because having a children's minister who really understands that and is willing to kind of drive that forward with other ministers will be really, really incredibly helpful. So I know I haven't met the minister. I'm meeting her in a few weeks. I'm looking forward to that. But she's definitely trying to get out and about, to speak to families and to hear different experiences. So I know that she will be very open to making sure that we can do better for adoptive families.
Can I ask then, maybe a follow-up, is there what's the word on the street in terms of the Adoption Support Fund? Will it be, and obviously there's a spending review due in the autumn, is there any hint of where that's going to go?
Well, so I think there's been an understanding that it's definitely going to be kept next year. So that's something pre-spending review, that a commitment's already been made for that. But I think, it's difficult for me to say because I'm not in government, but I guess the mood music is that people are really committed to continuing to support families in this way. I think it's going to be really interesting with the new government about that interface with health and about improving children's services for mental health in particular, because I think there's a different I'm getting the sense of a different sort of commitment across health and DFE. DFE and health have not really spoken a lot to each other around these issues to do with children's mental health, but there is definitely a feeling of, a new team kind of being pulling together, looking across. So that's encouraging. But yeah, I've not heard anybody talking about it stopping or anything like that. So I think, I don't think there's any chance of that in the short term. But
you heard it here first.
So
I did have a broader question. You talked about some interesting models around the idea of contextual safeguarding and models that would sort of have be able to be applied to adoption. Is there a sense that actually, and we mentioned this at the very beginning before you came, we reflected that actually, as much as this is a conference about safeguarding families in adoption, the reality is that our experiences are not unique, that if we were a kinship family, that probably a lot of the things that we were talking about would resonate really strongly. And likely, if we were a family with a child with additional needs, this would be, a child, maybe neurodivergent or a physical disability or had experienced adversity. All of a sudden, this message, is there a potential that we could be the tip of a spear in that if we drive through change, that we could, is it a much more palatable message when we link it to many more children?
Yeah, I feel in a way that the contextual safeguarding Roth approach actually opens the door to question traditional child protection kind of models and frameworks and pathways. And I think particularly where you are not I think children with additional needs is also another interesting factor, because there can be a lot of factors that are very similar to the ones that you're experiencing. But certainly my experience of working in fostering adoption kinship teams for the last 20 odd years, the families in kinship arrangements often have a similar issue, particularly special guardianship. And so there are definitely some similarities. I guess the question is, do you have a pathway just for adoptive families, or is it actually a pathway for where you've got children that actually aren't born to you, in the sense of, it's a substitute family, it's a different family than your birth family. That might be a good question to ask and reflect on and think about whether it applies in different ways. It feels kind of that we need a more flexible approach and a slightly different lens, and whether you just look at that more broadly across the child protection approach and pathway, maybe that's the answer, rather than developing different pathways or different models. I don't know. I think you raised a really interesting question and something for us to ponder on. Al.
Yeah. Well, I think in some ways it's about selling it, isn't it? It's about, if we can sell it as this is a model that really benefits lots of children and lots of families, then people will pick it up and potentially. Sorry, Fiona, I cut across you rudely.
I think that it does need to be there does need to be a specific model. As a child protection social worker who's taken families to court, who's removed children, who's been through most of the parts of a journey of a child's life from start to finish in this area, we do need to look at a family's identity. How were you built as a family is really, really important. Obviously not detracting from safeguarding is safeguarding, and the child's safety is paramount and all that. That's always going to be the bullseye. But we do need to look at the other areas and the other issues and the other perspectives, and like I said before, the whole of the family, not just what the social worker wants to see. A couple of questions from me, and I'm not very good at answering the questions online. Sorry, Al. I do want to. I just can't multitask to that level. The relationship, like you've said before, the relationship is between RAA and safeguarding social worker is a national thing, and there's different areas are doing it differently. And I don't know whether I've shared this, but when I was going to ask for Section 20, because I couldn't manage all three kicking off all at the same time because it was awful, I got told by the post-adoption social worker that I would be destroyed by the local authority for asking. What do you feel is the undercurrent between these services, given that so many of us are saying we're not believed and we're not heard, and then post-adoption, there's a big tendency for RAA social workers to drop back and safeguarding social workers to lead the front, as it were?
Well, I think the interface is very different. I think broadly speaking, let's be honest, local authorities are reluctant for children to come into care. We don't want children to come into care wherever possible. And I think there is a definite, and I think that's absolutely right and appropriate, because we do know that, care is not necessarily the right thing for a lot of children and doesn't actually improve their outcomes. So I think that preventative approach, preventing children from coming into care, is a key priority for local authorities. So I think when an adoptive parent is asking for Section 20, you must have reached a real crisis point where actually you can't do what you need to do. And I was talking about this recently with colleagues around the issue to do with short breaks and adopters recharging their batteries and being able to continue and access to having short breaks. And actually, there's a real tension in that in terms of short breaks. But there's lots of different ways to do short breaks. But there is a massive gap in the ability of adoptive families being able to access any short break provision, whether that be because often, and you'll know this better than me, support networks fall away. You don't often have extended family who can help with the children. And actually, all you really need is just some time away to just recharge your batteries, have an afternoon, have a day. Doesn't always have to include overnight stays, but have different ways of being able to access short breaks to recharge your batteries so that you get a chance to look after yourself. Because if you can't look after yourself, then you're no good for looking after children, are you? And I think that it's well understood for children with disabilities. There's a whole sort of legal framework Now, the adoption agency regulations are very clear that short breaks should be offered and that short breaks and respite are a provision that should be available to families, but it's really difficult to access it, and there's a lack of provision. So I know in the Midlands Together collaboration, through some funding that Adoption England are providing, they're doing some innovation work around looking at different approaches. So they're doing some co-production work with adoptive families as to what short breaks provision might look like. So and all sorts of different ways of doing it. Some about, you know, the family together going away, but parents and children having some time apart, you know, short breaks in terms of afternoons, evenings, some overnights. What would it look like? Because at the moment, if you look at short breaks, it's under Section 17 or Section 20 of the Children Act. That's how people can access short breaks. And obviously, you don't always want children to come back into care because they've come from care. So there's that whole issue about children returning to care. So it feels like, for me, there's a lot of work that we could do around that sort of short break space. But I think you're absolutely right. People do, when they ask for Section 20, it's often local authorities like, oh, is there a different way? Can we do something different? Can we put a package of supporting?
I think there's a tendency for local authorities to ignore the requests now because there's a fear of bringing a child into care. When I asked for Section 20, I didn't want my children to go into care.
Yeah.
I wanted a break because I'd ended up as a single parent of 3 children who fight.
Yeah.
And it wasn't sustainable, it wasn't manageable, and nobody could see that because I was the only one who saw their behaviour.
Yeah.
You know, schools were supportive, but they didn't live with me.
Yeah.
My parents didn't live down the road. My support network disappeared. You know, there's hundreds of families that have the same experience as I do.
Mm-hmm.
And when you ask for something, and the judgment is on, oh, well, you sort of trying to get rid of your child. No, I want to be able to look after myself, otherwise I'm not strong enough to look after them.
Yeah.
I think there needs to be more ownership of where is that parent at that point in their journey.
Yeah.
You know, my situation is I can't sit, like, I've got PTSD now because I'm waiting for it to happen constantly.
Yeah.
And you know, where's the recognition of what we go through? I didn't sign up to be a victim of domestic abuse, but I am.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm safe now because I'm not being hit. But we need that understanding of what's going on for a parent to go through our local authorities, through our RAAs, and for these conversations to be had and shouted about, because otherwise we're not going to get the understanding that we need.
That's right. I mean, the Mockingbird model, I don't know if you've heard about Mockingbird. Yeah. So Mockingbird offers a really helpful support for adoptive families, but it's not all. So Mockingbird has got a very particular model and fidelity to the model, and you can't move away from that model. But that does really scaffold and support some families. So Mockingbird-like approaches is something that we're really keen to pilot and trial. And there is some work going on in different, like in Adoptees, they're doing some work with adopter hubs who do a similar type of approach. But it's not called Mockingbird, it's something slightly different. Otherwise, they'd be in trouble.
I have to pay for it. Can I ask, firstly, never mention respite again, because literally you've set the Zoom on fire.
Sorry, I see all the questions coming in now.
There's not a lot of questions, but there's an awful lot of opinions. A lot of people expressing really how the dynamics are really complicated for people in terms of, and I think that someone said it's the Holy Grail. It is the Holy Grail. So it is interesting that it feels like that it's, but also I think within the adoption, there's a culture within it that, well, you said forever. So you didn't sign up, if you're a foster carer or a kinship carer, but you said forever. So that's interesting. But one of the questions, a few people are asking lots of questions, and could I ask you to, when you finish your little session, is to go on mute to think, but there's lots of questions. And so if you've got 10 minutes to answer them, that would be really, really appreciated, because people have got some quite specific questions. But one question I would like to ask, maybe, thank you, I appreciate that. But one of the questions a few people have mentioned that actually that when the process, some people feel like it's not an appropriate phrase, but this idea that the child that they were offered is not the child that they got. And that whether that's by just a lack of, a quality assurance in terms of the report writing, or a subterfuge. And we've all read referrals that have said, he's a cheeky chappy, which is code for he likes to set fire to cars. And that's an extreme. But and so one of the people said, that is the only reproach for that to actually take up legal action, and that's one of the people in the questions who's done that. How are we going to? Is there a way that we can change that? Because that feels like fundamental to some of the later challenges that then manifest.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of work that goes on when a child, when you've got a plan for adoption. So one of the things we've been really advocating is having a really good holistic assessment of children's needs at that point, and not just projecting what their needs are in the short term, but what their needs are in the longer term. Now, there are some children where there is some uncertainty. You don't always know that, particularly very young children, when their development, maybe is not progressing, or there's sort of research and knowledge. I mean, just to give you an example, many, many years ago, we're talking probably 20 years ago, I was involved with a family when I was assessing social worker. I was a team manager, actually, and we placed a baby with the adopters, and we knew that mum had taken drugs, and there hadn't been any alcohol, but there'd been drug misuse, different types of drugs. And at that point, we had the research that said, actually, it doesn't look as harmful as if you'd been taking alcohol. And so, people look at the potentially long-term implications, and they make a judgment call on whether they feel they can meet the needs of that child. Now that child has gone on to have massive complications and massive issues, and massive repercussions for the family. And at that time, to be honest with you, we genuinely didn't know the longer term impact of some of that. We could maybe guess some of it, but some of the research wasn't available. But we know so much more now on the impact of these things and on the impact of trauma. And actually, having a really good understanding and a trauma timeline and understanding of the impact on children is really important at that early stage. So we are doing a lot of work with children's social workers, child permanence reports. There's a lot of quality assurance about the information in those reports, so that adoptive families should have all the information that the social worker has. So nothing should be not given because it's difficult information. That actually all of that information, and you are legally obliged to share that information with adopters. So we are very clear that information has to be shared. I guess we're also clear that ideally we would love to get to a position where we have a multidisciplinary assessment of a child's needs. And I guess that's where some of the multidisciplinary teams are coming in, where there's a bit of like, we're not really sure what's going on here. We're not sure whether there's neurodiversity issues or things like that. So I think if we can get better at that, that would be helpful. But there has to be honesty. And I think if there's, deceit around that, then that's really concerning. And for me, that's happening. Ethical issue.
I think it's quite common from what I'm hearing, and I work in fostering now, and I see referrals. So I think, okay, I'll translate what you've written, but why can't we just say it how it is? I feel that a child at the start of their journey should have an impact map, and this is what we're going to predict. And I know that sounds like, oh, you can't say what's going to happen, but we do. We need a way of tracking what support is needed, what therapy is needed, what healing is needed. And for me, we're fundamentally failing children by not preparing for things. I'm not saying let's write off every child who's ever experienced trauma, but I'm saying let's prepare for it better. Let's acknowledge it. Let's expect it. Let's expect the wobbles, the challenges, the tricky bits. And just on, I know we've got a break out, but just on my last bit with this is that factualness is that, like people being believed. We're often not believed as adopters in the trials and tribulations that we struggle with and suffer. But then who checks out what the social worker's writing? And I'll finish on
that. I'm not going to put you on the point because that's an impossible question to answer, isn't it? And Sarah, we thank you so much for sharing, but also I think more specifically sort of putting your sort of self into the lion's den, because I think that if you've got time, please do go on and look at some of the questions, because then people have genuinely got good questions, but also if you've got time, look at the chat, because I think it is just a stark reminder that people are, of people's kind of actually lived experience. Because I think sometimes, in the corners of the country, that how things work out very different to the leafy suburbs of Kensington, where I know that you spend all your time as the strategic lead. I'm sure you don't.
Thanks, Sarah. I really appreciate it.
Oh no, I've really enjoyed the discussion, and let's keep talking, and let's take this discussion forward. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.